Well, for my research, I had articles about um, predictors of injury and conflict prevention and how that relates to the use of restraints. And basically, it was a lot of what the young people perceive um, as they're being restrained or secluded. So, like, mentioning how it increases anxiety and like fear and anger and just like a lot of negative emotions for both restraints and seclusion. Um, and that increasing the use of like de-escalation would be and behavior management would be a lot more beneficial for those situations, but also that staff in those situations need to be like supported. So if um, eliminating restraints were to happen, like, and they would need support with like recertification, training, coaching, supervision, and all that. So these are like ways to like uh, support and like change how. I guess that my argument is that restraints aren't really trauma informed or ethical, but also it's just hard to find a way to manage those situations if you don't have any tools if it gets to that point. So like staff need support as well. That was basically my research. And then like injury. One of a quote from the paper that I read was there is likely no method of physically restraining someone that can be consequence free. And then it just went into like who is more likely to be injured through restraints and stuff like that. So that's pretty much my research.
All right. Sweet. That's interesting because the first article, like, not necessarily my opinion, but the articles. The first article I did was professional practice and ethical issues related to physical restraint and seclusion in schools. And it argued that most of the time, when restraint, like physical restraint and seclusion, is used, it's when the safety of the individual presenting the quote unquote bad behavior or is in danger, or those around them, or the educators, even. And so a lot of times it can be necessary, as the article says, but most times people aren't properly trained on how to properly do it. So it's not trauma informed in that way. And often when there could be other interventions used, such as behavior training or like lots of other different interventions, and they're not actually trained and they just instantly go straight to physical restraint and seclusion. It also touches on how that can affect the person, how a lot of times those experiencing that have disabilities. And those disabilities typically relate to social interaction and behavior. And so when you're creating more trauma or adding to it, it's hard for these individuals to build those social skills that they're already struggling with. The second one was A Wicked Problem, Chemical Restraint Towards a Definition. And it really touches base on how chemical restraint isn't consensual. And so often it causes a lot of trauma and memory loss. And it can even cause like physical problems, like because it's a depressant. So it slows down your breathing, your heart rate, and all that stuff. So it can be very dangerous in many different ways. Overall, between these two, it discusses ethics, and it talks about how it's unethical, but sometimes it is necessary for the safety of everyone around. It's just the problem is no one's properly trained in it, and they always just go instantly to some kind of restraint without actually going to other interventions first.
Nice.
All right. So mine, I actually have two articles as well, and the first one talks about restraint, as we all are assigned to. So it's basically the influence of residential workers, social climate, in the use of restraints and seclusion. So it is actually a descriptive study and uses like around 180 plus 198 social workers in their perception. So the results are implying that whenever they have a training in the micro level interactions to meet the needs of the youth first, that could basically favor the interventions for the social climate. So sometimes these social workers are also pressured whether they need to use the restraint or not. So because once the aggressive behavior is present, then they might have the no choice at all but to use restraint and seclusion, because we all knew that from Nicole's discussion that once the behavior is there and they're already having the episode, we cannot do so much about it. And so that's basically the social climate of those workers in terms of using restraint in a way that they need to have proper ratio aside from the pattern or the standard protocol of how to use it. And sometimes they need to talk about it so that they won't be forced to apply the protocol on hand, but rather use the compassionate way instead of using that. So that's for my first article. And then for the second one is the staff intervention and youth behaviors in the child welfare residents. So it's basically a descriptive study as well, and it uses 84 interventions based on the analysis. And the odds of aggression are lower when the staff talks to the youth compared with other interventions. So it means that they are using physical restraints, but when they started developing relationship with the youth and they have the talk or the micro techniques that was also mentioned to my prior study, it means that the tendencies of having aggression and therefore reducing the usage of restraints for the youth as well. There.
Awesome. So yeah, I guess a lot of our articles really cover a lot of the same things, and the fact that a lot of professionals aren't necessarily like trauma informed or have a full understanding of when restraint is really needed and when there's other options that could be used, I've noticed.
Yeah, true. And also, I am also favorable with the findings that you had that the use of chemicals for restraints, because sometimes it's very understandable that when the youth are on their episode right away, you just can't, you can only do so much as a social worker or youth worker, right? So we
Mhm.
have to, yeah, we have to divert to different kinds of methods, even though sometimes it's beyond the call already. Mm-hmm.
Mhm. Exactly. And there was quite a few notes within this article where they were saying like there's nurses where they're at the point where like the individual or the patient's trying to harm themselves like physically, like they're grabbing things and trying to do whatever, and they're like the only option I have is chemical restraint. And so from that perspective I kind of understand it, but it's just I wish there was more training for these professionals so that they don't just automatically go, okay, I'm going to restrain this individual, okay, I'm going to do this, okay, I'm going to do that, because they're a danger, right?
Yeah. In one of my papers, it mentioned how like staff stress levels could be tied to like the use of restraints and like the frequency of it. And as we all know, very understaffed, um, a lot of burnout in the field. So it's like, I think, and like that's also part of like the ethics is like taking care of your own values and like stuff like that. So it's like they need to be supported. And as Kara said, like more training on how to manage these situations before they escalate to the point where a restraint is like the only option you have at that time.
Mm-hmm.
True.
Oh, I
True.
totally agree.
It was also quoted in my study that if this sentiment is shared by all the workers, probably they will be able to intervene more in a manner that's considerate to the youth. You know what I mean? Like rather than escalating the violence right ahead, so they can do better about it if proper training is provided for them.
Mhm.
No, exactly. And it would definitely prevent more of trauma being put on these individuals. Like they're already traumatized as it is most of the time, right? And so all these restraints just adds to that. And maybe they are traumatized in the way where they were held down or they were assaulted or anything like that, and physically restraining someone would put them right back into that area, like that
Yeah.
spot.
Yeah, and I feel like the interpersonal relationship part is like one of my articles that I was reading talked about how oh my goodness. I just lost my train of thought. Basically how let me look at my notes. I think I just forgot. I'm so sorry.
No, you're all good.
Yeah, I think that's valid, Megan, because it's basically the interpersonal aspect that should be, prioritized, especially us as incoming practitioners, because we'll never know, right? Will we end up working? So I think it's very important to develop that aspect in us, right? As early as now.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to get at. The
Yeah.
interpersonal aspect is like if restraining someone increases their like anxiety and shame and anger, and there's that power dynamic, then like it's gonna affect the relationship and their ability to see the place they're at as a safe place if they're being like, as Kara said, like the cumulative trauma that is happening by being restrained. So like it is like a difficult path to like manage.
No, 100%. Yeah, no, really just touching on how it's like not only affecting the individual being restrained, but also the people having to do the restraining. Because I know, like, personally, I would feel so uncomfortable having to do that. But at the same time, like, if I feel the need to do that, I can't imagine what I'm dealing with. I don't know if I'm making any sense, but
True, true.
No, like your own values, like
Yeah.
that's one of the points, like how it may support or interfere with the job requirement, which the job requirement would be restraining someone if they were a danger to themselves or others, whereas you would be like super uncomfortable doing that, and therefore it might not be effective, you know, because like if that's a fear-based thing or just like a I don't know, a compassionate thing, it's like maybe you wouldn't be able to um what's the word? Like do a restraint effectively because of that value.
yeah, I wouldn't be able to practice properly with the individual.
Because
Yeah.
you'll be like, half-hearted if it's gonna fit. Is it proper? Is it morally safe? Is it, are you doing it ethically as a practitioner? So it's basically a dilemma for us workers. And at the same time, we have to take note of our safety as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
So, yeah. So, in terms of their mental health, any notes about that or thoughts about that? Like, how could restraint impact youth's mental health?
I
I
don't.
think
Oh,
go
sorry.
for it, Kara.
I don't see it being in a positive way. I mean, physically, they're being alienated, they're being held down. Like in many situations, that could be almost deemed like assault, right? Where you're being held down and held against your will, and then to be secluded from the class or from the group of people because you were behaving badly. It just feels like you're alienating and making whatever they're going through even worse, because I'm pretty sure they're going through something if they're presenting this bad behavior. And then even with like chemical restraints, like it's taking people's memory away. They don't know what happened. Like that's got to be so traumatizing and obviously affect their mental well-being.
Yeah, I agree. Like if they're already accessing services that are involved with mental health, there's already stuff going on, and then restraints on top of that. I also don't see it impacting them in any physical way, especially their mental health. So, and I get that they are necessary at times, and there's no real way around that. Because one of the papers I was reading was also like the training and like all the, things you could do to like reduce the amount of restraints being used. It doesn't necessarily mean that the number of aggressive like behavior incidents would change. So it's like I get that it's necessary, but I don't think it's positively impacting anyone who's being restrained.
And also, considering my research, mostly the subjects were susceptible to mental health risks, particularly addressing the indigenous population and the juvenile offenders. And the presence of the aggressive behavior, we all are admittedly guilty into it, that it can be addressed by restraint and seclusion, right? But once this research has examined how interactional aspects really, how interactional aspect change or promote initiatives in reducing the use of these things, can somehow alleviate what they're going through. Because I agree with you both that they are already suffering mental health, they have mental health conditions, that's why they're in the facility, and the use of that is particularly being imposed for the aggressive behavior that they are manifesting. So whether we use chemicals or stuff, they are really there already. So what are we going to do to intervene about it? And that's basically the chunk of the beauty of this assignment is all about, that we get to collaborate and talk about it, like how interactional can we be, right? So
Mhm.
there.
And I totally agree with that. And also looking into what are they trying to communicate through this behavior? Like, what is going on for them? Why are they presenting this? Why are they communicating to us this way? Like, what are they trying to say? Kind of thing.
Mhm.
And then it would be easier to help them from there, knowing what they actually need.
And I feel like all of our papers kind of touch on like preventing it before it happens,
Mm-hmm.
which is like, as I said, like restraints, I don't think you'd be able to eliminate them completely, because like sometimes it is necessary to stop someone from hurting themselves or others, but uh yeah, it's
I feel like it gets overused, like in situations that it's not actually like your last choice. Like I feel like it's used as
mhm,
first choice rather than like last resort. Okay, we don't have any more options. We need to like hold this guy down because he's gonna hurt someone or himself. But
mhm,
instead of going, okay, let's try this, okay, let's try that, okay, let's try this, okay, let's try that. And when none of that works, then
mhm.
finally like, hey, we have to go for this.
Yeah. And I feel
Right.
like that could also like tie into someone's values, where it's like if they value, their own safety, I think they're going to be more inclined to use a physical restraint
Mhm.
to like as their first choice. And I feel like it just really depends on a lot of different values in that moment.
No,
Sure.
100%.
So for number three, in terms of compliance with our CYC Code of Ethics and Standards that we're about to memorize, right, guys?
Yeah, all of
So,
them.
do you think the use of restraints comply, or if does not? Any thoughts about that based on your researches?
Personally, I think it does and it doesn't. I think it doesn't in the fact, like with the code of ethics, when it comes to the individual that you're trying to help, like the young person, I think it goes against like their right to have say in what their treatment is, and how they're going to go with this and just overall their quality of life. But then when it comes to code of ethics with the workplace and yourself, it might be necessary for the safety of you and your coworkers.
Yeah. And like number one under the responsibility to the client is like being responsible for ensuring that the relationship is therapeutic. And I feel like it says relationship. So like if you're holding someone down or using some other sort of restraint, I think you are in a way compromising that relationship. So in that way, I'd say it's not exactly ethical. I get that it's for their own well-being, that is the only reason it's happening, but it does compromise the relationship a little bit. And then also just like the toll it takes on like the professional in that situation also is like probably very stressful, and I don't think they get a lot of support in the aftermath of that.
No,
So,
totally.
yeah. So based on my study by Roy Seattle, the social workers thingy, I think the responsibility to the client harnessed they're more of recognizing and respecting the expectations and life patterns of their clients because they are proposing to have this interactional aspects, right? So they are more of like shaping these policies and advocating for the use of interactions rather than use of the onset restraint and seclusion right away. And to add up also with that, as child youth care practitioners, we know that as part of our ethics, we are responsible also for, ensuring that we participate in every studies or high quality researches. That's why we can access journals and studies like this. And I feel like in the studies that I've searched, all the informed consents and protocols, even the way that they develop mostly of their questionnaires because they use descriptive data was they're all ethically aligned and they followed it. So it's just a matter of implementation that's going to be a big deal because
Mhm.
actually nobody's documenting it, right? So I think
Yeah.
that's why actually out of those 84 intervention in my second study, they actually have an original of 100 plus and they just documented 84 for the study itself. So that
Mhm.
speaks a lot about ethics and how they wanted to, frame everything in a favorable side, which
Mhm.
basically is understandable, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm, no, for sure.
Okay. So for number four, are the use of restraints trauma informed? And if not, could they be?
I don't believe that they are, because to be trauma informed, you have to A, be aware of the individual's trauma and their history and their mental health, and B, respond to it accordingly. And I feel like with restraints, like I said earlier, if someone was maybe abused or assaulted or something, being held down would be so triggering for them and just add to that trauma.
Yeah. I also agree that I don't think there's really any way to be trauma informed about restraining another person because it's going to be traumatic no matter what. But I think seclusion might be a better
Yeah.
way to combine trauma informed practice and like keeping people safe basically because I think putting your hands on someone, that is where it gets ethically tricky, I think. But like I think there could be ways to make seclusion safe for everyone and less traumatic, not completely trauma free, but like less traumatic maybe.
Yeah.
True. I actually agree with that, Megan, because my first study, Fraser of 2016, is both of actually their studies uses that isolation room or the sometimes physical restraint. The study resulted that it led to higher odds of aggressive behavior compared to talking. However, it's very interesting that they suggest that these various form of intervention, like the seclusion, may lead to the behavior of the kids opposing, but not necessarily increase their level of aggression. Because what you said that if you're experiencing something and you tend to isolate them in a way, so they don't get to be aggressive. So it makes sense that their study found out those kinds of findings and but then I believe that being trauma informed will basically rely on the practitioners ourselves of how we do it. Like, do we talk to them? Do we cater during their intakes, or do we, prioritize the necessary information that we needed to know? Or yeah, because sometimes we're operating in shifts, right? Like what we
Mhm.
discussed in classrooms, that sometimes you just have to carry on the next shift and you don't know what happened prior to that. And it depends on the logbook that you're reading if, it's going to
Mhm.
be trauma informed or not. So I think it will all depend on how we will be implementing or applying it in our daily work as professionals soon to be.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I
Oh,
for like seclusion specifically, like I remember, I think it was in Andrea's class for one of the facilitated discussions. One of the papers in the group that I was a part of had an anecdote of a young person being like highly escalated and the worker locked themselves in a room, and the child was like banging on the door, like begging them not to leave them alone. So I feel like seclusion is also traumatizing in a way, but like my idea when that story was presented, I was like, why not have a room where you could like put someone who's escalated, but like have like a window. It seems like an interrogation room, but like a window where they can see you and still talk to you, but like not break anything and not hurt you or themselves. And you can still keep an eye on them to really make sure they're not hurting themselves. Like something like that, I feel like would be so much better for everyone involved. And to continue giving care when someone's escalated.
Yeah. And I feel like it would be easier to make those decisions if you have like a relationship with the individual and you actually like you understand them a bit more and you understand how they respond to things and how they handle different consequences, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
Yeah. That leads me to the last one, which is values can support or interfere with having use of physical restraints. Like, any thoughts about that? How our values may support or interfere?
I think we briefly touched on it with Kara. It was like, I think values could go either way. Like if you are uncomfortable with doing restraints, you might not be able to do them effectively, which could result in injury or like for yourself if you're not like doing it as firmly as you need to like keep them restrained. So you could get yourself hurt, you could get the child hurt. Like a lot of things could happen based on values, I think, in that situation.
And also, according to the study that I read, which is really, I find it really interesting because the observation is that the previous studies of compiled by Fraser is that they use the constraint methods, and they found out that it's very, actually I shared it in our practicum group that if the staff member is tenured, they get to use restraint and seclusion less. If they're new, it means they get to use it more. So I kind of relate to what Kara and Megan you are telling about that the implication of this can be like the experience of being a youth worker. How relational could we get? Like the approach that we need to do, the competencies that we need to based on. Like if Marlene actually affirmed that the older or the more mature you are in the profession, the less you get to use restraint and seclusion because you already have that kind of rapport with the youth or the youth that you're working with, which is kind of, yeah, good to know and good to learn. Yeah.
I feel like if that is the case, then I feel like supervision should be more important than allowing people to use more restraints because they're newer. You know what I'm saying?
True. Yeah, that
Like,
makes a lot of sense too. Yeah.
like just have someone that has that relationship that's gonna be able to de-escalate the situation instead of just being like, oh, this person's newer, so it totally makes sense for them to restrain this upset person.
Oh yeah.
Probably that's the reason why they have issues with ratios because in terms of shifting and stuff, that's why they need more child youth care practitioners.
They need they need more support as well, I think, because high turnover because of the lack of support.
True. Okay, so any additional notes that we can?
I know one of the points that I didn't find in any of my research was about if it affects the brain or like what part specifically. If it did, I don't know anything specifically, but like I feel like trauma does affect the brain. So like restraints are probably not going to help someone who's developmentally behind if, they're being restrained. I don't think it's helpful for the damage that's already been done. That is the reason they're accessing the service.
That's very true.
But other than that, I think we talked about all the points we needed to.
Yeah. I think
all the points.
In terms of the brain thingy, it's like more of if, for example, let's put ourselves on this youth, right? If I have issues already and I cope negatively and you're gonna seclude me in one place and not bother talking to me, how do you think that would make me feel, right? So
Yeah.
it's like
Exactly.
more of bombarding a lot. I have a lot of stress hormones in me already, and you're gonna
Hmm.
subject me to that and leave me there for 2 weeks or so. So I
Yeah.
think it's not gonna help me anyway to
Like
resolve my issues.
aggravating
True.
already
Hmm.
Yeah.
prominent issue.
Plus the fact that when you restrain them or seclude them, you get to confiscate, or you get to, what do you call that, suppress their vices, or if they
Hmm.
are using substance and stuff like that. Wherein, could you imagine if you have high level of dopamines and stuff? Like,
Hmm.
remember, you're the one who presented ketamine,
Yeah.
right? So imagine if you don't have that enough supply in your
Hmm.
brain, and then you're gonna be subjected to one area and nobody cares or even, wanted to
Yeah.
attend to your concerns. So I think it's gonna mess everything up. Yeah.
Yeah.
Even at the school aspect, like if you look at the social part, like being secluded from the classroom and everyone witnessing that, like there's almost like embarrassment and
Hmm.
shame that goes along with it in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
True. Yeah.
So yeah.
So yeah. So do we turn on our camera for picture, or that's it?
I don't even have a camera
Or
attached
do
to
we
my
turn on our
computer.
camera for goodbyes, or just I'll
Here.
just talk? This is so funny.
There's my hand waving
All
goodbye.
right, so I'm just gonna turn it on for the sake of, yeah, we didn't we're all present here.
Thanks, Pia.
There we go.
Okay, I'm
So
waving.
I
That's my hand.
appreciate you guys, yeah, for the time, and for, it was really a meaningful discussion. I've learned a lot personally based on the
Yeah.
researches. It's really nice to hear different perspectives, and that we're all in this. We all have, I think, unified values in terms
Yeah.
of, yeah. So yeah.
This is a good discussion. Thanks
I
for
know.
being in my group, everybody.
Yeah, that was
All
awesome.
right. You have a happy weekend. It's a
Oh
long
yeah.
weekend, so
Happy
yeah.
long weekend.
All righty.
All right. See
Bye,
ya.
guys.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Bye.